It's my pleasure to be joined today by Eric Berlin, who is head of the cannabis practice at Dentons, the largest law firm in the world. And I'll turn it over to Eric so I, do justice to his biography and his background by giving him the opportunity to do it in his own words. But thank you, Eric, for joining me today on this conversation and being part of the SparkNet content side.
Anand, thank you very much. And I'm really honored that you invited me and happy to uh, uh, be here chatting with you and providing some content to folks who would hopefully benefit from it. You're correct. I am head of the cannabis sector group, both globally and in the US for Dentons, which is now the largest law firm in the world. I have been involved in the industry now, I guess, 14 years. I first got involved really in 2008 is where it started. And in 2009, I worked pro bono to help craft and eventually over the years get passed the Illinois medical cannabis bill, which was one of the first to go through the legislature as opposed to as a ballot initiative. I then was brought into Ohio to help redraft that bill and help get that passed. And at that point, I looked up and knew that I was fascinated with this industry. It was important to me personally. And there was so much opportunity ahead that I saw how much legal work there could be done as well. A few years later, I moved my practice to Dentons and now spend 100% of my time for clients in or impacted by the cannabis industry. And of course, I say that what I mean by the cannabis industry, in fact, has gotten more rich and more complicated over time.
Thank you for that background, and really thank you for being part of the industry in the ways that you have contributed. The Midwest is an important section of the market, and as things have kind of progressed from the West Coast over to the Midwest and East Coast, great to know kind of your background and involvement there. So I'll start off with kind of the high level. So a lot of our audience are newer to the industry. They're kind of waiting on the sidelines. They're certainly have been impressed by some of the news headlines they've seen. I'd say recently in the last year or two, there's been less excitement just given that there hasn't significant kind of progress in the regulatory front. But before we get there, because a lot of the folks are newer and they might not realize some of the facts about the industry, could you give an overview in terms of the size or where you kind of see the scope of this industry now going, given how long you've been in the space?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And let me just define that, and we can talk later about this, but when we talk about industry, we're referring to the state legal and regulated commercial sale of medical cannabis or cannabis for adult use.
Yes.
And I say that because they're now intoxicating hemp-derived products and the illicit market, which is as large as the legal market. So with respect to just that state legal regulated market, there are now 38 states that have legalized medical cannabis, the sale of medical cannabis. Among those 38 now, 21 have legalized for adult use. And that leaves a handful of states that permit high CBD, low THC cannabis. THC is the substance that we all know is the intoxicant in cannabis, although it's more complicated than that. CBD is, in fact, already a FDA-approved drug in the brand name Epidiolex, and so it's seen as having medical benefits. That leaves just 3 states that continue to prohibit cannabis entirely. That results in a market, just in terms of state legal retail sales, of about 25 billion and growing year by year with like a 20% CAGR. In addition to that, you have economic impact of the industry, which is calculated to be about 100 billion. So it is a really, I think that surprises folks as to how large the industry is. Um, that answers your question, Anand, but I want to go back and address one thing you said, that
Sure.
while there hasn't been greater express um, federal reform, and I think in some ways there has been, including Biden's recent announcement, there's been tremendous movement on the state level and tremendous growth in the industry. And yet you said 2 years, another 2 years where the federal government has purposely chosen not to enforce against the industry, which has legal implications in and of itself. So I do think that there is a somewhat of a misperception that the industry is entirely in doldrums and hitting a wall and may not be going forward, right? I mean, first of all, clearly this industry is going forward in one form or another. And we know that because the demand is there. For example, I mentioned this earlier. Um, there still in the United States is about $45 billion of illegal cannabis sold each year, right? So it's one thing our federal government and folks like in the FDA miss. We're not looking at a universe where we have cannabis versus no cannabis. We already have cannabis. And so there's good reason to believe this industry will move forward. Uh, I would also say that it's really important to see the growth and where the growth is coming from. Missouri, which is a very conservative state, just legalized cannabis for adult use. So while I understand the feeling like maybe the federal government's stuck and folks holding their money, I think there's tremendous growth and continued non-enforcement. So a lot of opportunities.
That's a great point. And, I think it's a testament to see that example, Missouri, going legal. I was surprised to see that. I'm surprised to see progress in other states like West Virginia, coming online. So could you talk about we'll kind of start off with kind of the big anticipation in the industry, and then maybe we can drill down. For folks that are not insiders in the space and have not seen some of the progress you've mentioned, and don't realize the size and scope of that, and the fact that the demand from the black market is a clear indicator. For example, we don't have moonshine really sold in the U.S.
Not
anymore.
much.
The alcohol market is pretty regulated, but just the size of that compared to the legal side is still stunning. And some of the roadblocks there, and the reason the black market has continued to thrive, obviously, are some of the regulatory caps and handicaps in the industry that legal operators have to deal with. So let's start with perhaps safe banking. The big one in terms of where a lot of people are focused on and wondering what could happen with that bill. And obviously, you have a good amount of interaction and knowledge and conversation on that front. If you could give us a overview of how you might be involved with what's happening there, or what your thoughts might be on where things stand with that particular bill, that'd be helpful for our audience.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna sort of start at the beginning to make it clear what that bill does.
Sure.
Safe banking really arises because of the amount of cash that flows in the state legal industry. Because it's state legal, yet federally illegal, many, but not all, banks have refused to bank the cannabis industry, which means that even folks who are following state law precisely and doing all the right things to secure their facility and make sure only the right people are getting their hands on cannabis, are often still having to deal in cash, and particularly cash at the point of sale, so at the dispensary. Because it's cash intensive, it's resulted in robberies and even in a few cases, death. And so, for safety reasons and just for good financial transparency, it's important that the money from the industry get banked properly. So what safe banking would do is really two things. Number one, it provides a safe harbor to financial institutions that want to bank the industry. It basically says money coming from the industry can be deposited in the bank. That's not going to violate any law. So if you're a depository industry, feel free to bank the industry. Number two, and I would say in many ways more important, the bill would make sure that proceeds from state legal, state regulated cannabis sales would no longer be considered proceeds of a crime for federal anti-money laundering law. That would help eliminate the amount of cash in the industry and bring it into the regulated financial industry. So it's a way of regulating the industry more and providing greater safety around the cash that's in the industry. It was originally going to be, well, it's been worked on for a while, to be clear. It's passed the House several times. It's never gotten through the Senate. And so they were going to push it through the Senate. The decision was to attach it to the defense authorization bill. And at the last minute, that got rejected, which leaves us this year with only one option, which is to get the safe banking provisions attached to the omnibus spending bill. The omnibus spending bill traditionally serves as a fairly large carrying bill for other provisions. So it's not unusual to do that. But at the same time, here we are having the Democrats holding both the House and the Senate for 2 years and really having gotten nothing done on cannabis reform. Nothing at all. I mean, it's been really great that a lot of bills have been brought and a lot of really good bills have been brought. But at the same time, nothing's gotten passed. So this is the end where we are, Anand, at least for 2022. And there have been objections raised to safe banking now at the last minute. And I'll provide those just so the audience can get a feel for what sort of things are being objected to. I'd rather not go into all the senators' names and sort of call folks out at this point. But the objections that have been, other than McConnell obviously came out very publicly and took pride in continuing to block the advancement of the rule of law in this area. So the objections to safe banking are things like what's going to happen to the money that's been out there and is already dirty? Does that get into the banking system, and what problems are caused by basically getting a lot of dirty money into the banking system? The question has been raised, would safe banking in and of itself increase money laundering? The example of that is states that aren't well regulated and folks funnel their dirty money through the state legal system and basically launder money that way. But it ignores two really important things. One, the states already vet those folks. All of the states have heavy vetting for anyone who's investing in the industry. And number two, there'll be regulations issued under this law to make sure that the money is coming only from state legal businesses. And to be state legal, you have to have clean money to begin with. Other objections to this are based on the notion, it's just, let me just back up. And in all due respect, I've seen this many times before, having worked on bills that have successfully passed in the state and worked on a lot of bills in the state and federal government. It's a game of whack-a-mole. You know, if someone doesn't want to get this done and they just start throwing things up. So one of the things that was thrown up is, well, the states have shown that they're not even capable of policing cannabis-related businesses. Well, that's not true. What the states are incapable of policing is the entirely large multi-billion-dollar illegal business, which the federal government has been incapable of taming over decades. What this all is about is bringing more of the rule of law into this situation so that money can be tracked, the right people are in the industry. And so pointing out something like the states haven't really been able to keep track of the illicit market while they have their state legal market, I think is a red herring. The other objection that I've heard is, why is this really necessary when we do have some banks banking the industry? And as you know, Anand, and perhaps some of the audience would know, the state legal cannabis industry is not a fully cash business. In fact, up until recently, I could walk down the street to my dispensary and make a payment on ATM, right? And many dispensaries have worked out that they have payment processing systems that work through ACH, for example, clearinghouse, all sorts of ways. And in fact, many companies have some level of banking, but that ignores that many don't, right? I mean, it's still a big problem in the industry, and that's what this bill's about. So to object to it saying, well, I think it's good enough, but I don't want to make it good or excellent, doesn't seem to be a very valid objection to me. So let me pause there on SAFE. I know I packed a ton in there, and see if you have questions or what I can unpack further.
No, thank you. That was a great overview, and then kind of specifics on, what are some of the challenges. And as you mentioned, the whack-a-mole issue, it's stunning to me that as the legal industry is, less than half or about half the size of the illicit market, that people have issues about turning it into a more trackable, traceable system, and really supporting the legal side, which you can tax and you can collect your taxes faster. And currently it's all cash based and tougher to track and slower to tax in those ways, and keep track of as a business that evolves. What's also a challenge, I think, is the business that are following the rules and are legitimate. It's hard for them to actually be seen as a true industry, because it's in that gray zone of, yes, state legal but federally not. In terms of some of those concerns, how do you think the industry can address them, if at all, for some of the folks that are dissenters? And what ultimately do you think is the timeline for this? And I know we're speculating by asking you for a timeline. It's anybody's guess, but how do you think things will be evolving in this space?
Okay, so on timeline, I'll say this. In my experience over the last 13, 14 years working on this, it is a grind. I know it may not always appear that way when all of a sudden, like 8 of 9 states pass ballot initiatives and everyone's like, it's happening so quickly. But it is hand-to-hand combat every day. And I am very disappointed that we're reaching the end of 2022 without any really good federal reform. But in some ways, I'm not surprised. And I had said from the beginning that the more money that's involved, the more stakeholders, the more difficult it is going to get anything passed. And so here we are. That doesn't mean that the timetable is 4, 5, 10 years, right? I do think that if the House is not going to be spending all of its time investigating Hunter Biden and the like, if there's some control for legislation, there are really important pro-cannabis legalization Republicans in the House, like Representative Dave Joyce from Ohio and Representative Nancy Mace from South Carolina. And I think they have really great ideas about legalizing cannabis. And I think there could be basically the Republican-controlled House passing a cannabis legalization bill or some piece of a cannabis legalization bill with the Democratic-controlled Senate passing it. I don't think it's not like, the perfect messy pass, but it's also not, somewhere between impossible and very doable, right? I'm not suggesting that I think it naturally will happen. I don't know. I don't think it's impossible either. And I think it's less than threading the eye of the needle. A lot depends on what the Republican House wants to do. So that's the timing. I mean, we could see things next year. And in this situation, It could be that we're not going to see anything until, a lame duck in 2024 or 2025. That's possible, but I have to tell you, I hear a lot of people saying that, but I think there's some openings that'll occur sooner than that. The additional thing that I would say is the action remains at the state level. And so to the extent that states come online and bring their programs online, like New York, which is going to be an uphill battle, get to that in a second, and have additional states pass, right? Minnesota is talking about passing, Kentucky, Ohio to full legalization. So these are, I mean, you start adding a state like that, I mean, it has tremendous impact on the industry itself. And so that's my segue to go back to one comment that you said, and I think it's a common perception of the industry that I'd like to address. So California remains a little bit wild, wild west. And I know it's a little unfair to say, well, let's put the fourth largest or fifth largest economy on earth to the side. But I'm asking you to do that anyway. And then I'm asking you to say, New York's in a point of transition, and because they're moving too slowly, the illegal market is sort of proliferating. But let's assume they get some control over that, but let's put New York to the side as well. Other than that, the industry runs pretty well. I mean, for example, there are not large cases of illegal money or money laundering happening through the industry. There have been lots of sting operations to go out to dispensaries and get them to sell to underage folks, and it rarely happens. Right. Compliance is on par or better with alcohol stores. There are all sorts of examples like that that I could give you, that it's not perfect by any means. It's a brand new industry growing at a tremendous rate. It's a big burden for everyone involved and the regulators, but most folks who are involved in the industry are doing their best to try to move this forward into a more rule of law state. And so that goes back to the point that you raised with alcohol. And I think, we have these, Pew and Gallup just released their most recent results, which continue to show around 90% favor legalization of medical cannabis, and for full adult use, it's been hovering around that like 68% over the last few years. I think if you start asking people a more specific question like, do you object to the legalization of cannabis in the same way that alcohol is now legal?
Right.
I think you get folks, and if you put it that way, like, do you object? I think you're more talking about like 20%, right? I mean, who are just going to object to anything cannabis. It's fairly non-objectionable, right? I mean, it is for those who favor the rule of law and those who favor strict compliance and good regulation. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not passing any judgment on whether that'd be good, bad, or indifferent for the industry. I'm just saying that it would generally be viewed as an upgrade from where the industry currently stands and is here permanently, right? I mean, this is not going away. So it a little bit mystifies me where you have our representatives blocking legislation in the area, right? Like, if you think about it that way, who wouldn't want, if you like, we're thinking about implementing greater rule of law over the state legal cannabis industry, and we're going to run it more like alcohol. You okay with that? And almost everyone say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, right? I mean, some people in the industry wouldn't like that. And you can get into really nuanced questions like, what does that mean for the FDA? But I'm just talking about like taking an industry that currently exists, that runs pretty well, but imperfectly, and adding on a layer of additional federal scrutiny and regulation. That's what we're talking about with legalization.
Right. And the interesting thing there also, I would say, and it's such a great point, I entered this industry coming from the finance world and being a CFA charter holder. And, 4 or 5 years ago, when I first entered it, people were like, wow, you're into pot. And I would explain, that's not the reasons I got in here. And now I get asked by people, well, my aging mother has, bad joint pain. What do you recommend? And I would say, well, I'm not a physician, or nor do I prescribe CBD or other forms, but I'm just glad to see that the attitude, the public opinion has changed. And that's because of the states that have come online. And New York, New Jersey are just starting kind of that journey. But in terms of public opinion, other than, kind of California and the Midwest, that's another big shoe to fall. And obviously there's some states in the South, certainly on the medical side, that have shifted opinion. The federal side to the banking issue is, this is now a global industry. I think people focus a lot on the US. I was actually born in India and lived in Ireland and then came to the US. So it's interesting to see, Thailand going online. It's interesting to see the progress in the UK and Germany and other EU countries, because ultimately those companies that want to operate in multiple geographies, they're not going to be able to easily do it unless there's some way to access the federal level banking system. And we to your point, we want to have a very good compliance and regulation platform around that to make sure there's no money laundering and other issues. But it's so necessary for America to do what America does, which is to create quality brands and to kind of lead the world in developing those and growing those globally.
Yeah. And everyone's waiting for us on it. Truly. I mean, my practice is absolutely global. I'm regularly in contact, and I'll tell you where we're working and where there's growth.
Sure.
But the United States is holding it up. I mean, that's the viewpoint of this. And so all of us, and in many ways, folks are now looking to Germany. Like, we're going to lose the edge on cannabis and branding and research and development because like folks are hung up on a stigma. So let me address the global point a little bit. But let me, if you don't mind, let me just go back to one other point, and then I'll tackle those. Is that okay? Yeah. Which is what moves people on this.
Yeah.
But because it explains what's happening in the South. And to be clear, among those 38 states that I listed that have legalized medical cannabis are Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma. I mean, these are conservative states. They're red states. I mean, no matter how you define conservative, they are deeply red states. And they've all done this, right? I will tell you, 10 years ago, that seemed unimaginable to me. And what I actually envisioned, I thought there'd be a chance that we would have legalization of cannabis on the federal level, but there would be states like Alabama and Mississippi that would continue to prohibit. And that would just be part of the system. And so the fact that people have moved faster on this, that the states, the great laboratories of democracy, are moving faster. I mean, in some ways, that's just the way it's meant to be. We're all very impatient with that, but it happens. And what actually, the reason that it happens that way is because people aren't really good with data. Like when I started on the advocacy side, I came, and it's the old days, there wasn't an iPad. I had binders. I went down to Springfield with binders of documents to answer everyone's question. I war gamed this from every single angle, and I had truly a satisfying answer to everything, which is why it was like a game of whack-a-mole, right? I mean, folks who didn't want this would just find something else to point to in order to not have that really real discourse on it. But what actually moves people on it, particularly on the medical side, is when they see their relatives get relief across the board. That is, when someone's Aunt Helen has cancer and uses cannabis to help deal with chemotherapy, and lo and behold is old Aunt Helen again, as opposed to being this person who is suffering. That is what moves people. And it's unfortunate that people can't take that in objectively, that they need that subjective. But across the board, that's what's happening, because there's still, culturally, a lot of discomfort with the substance. It's also interesting where that exists. So I mentioned the Pew and Gallup polls. And trust me, I'm coming to global. I'm getting there.
Yeah.
They point out the groups in order of their support of legalization. And almost every group now is above 50%. Isn't that interesting? Like, no matter how you cut it, every group's above 50%, except three. Those who go to church weekly, at least weekly. You know, some will go every day, but they're not horrible, but they're not yet over 50%. Folks who self-define as conservatives. Now, there are different ways that they cut this, and other ways, you know, Republicans rise up. But if you're like self-defined as conservative, and then the third lowest is adult Hispanics. And
Interesting.
you think of how ingrained that is in that culture. And I don't mean to speak for an entire culture, but I've spoken to quite a few folks about this. Anon, how messed up is that? I mean, this substance was made illegal in part to stigmatize brown-skinned people who were coming north of the border. I mean, that's what it was all about. That's part of it, but that
Yep.
was definitely part of it. And how when I read the legislative history and when I read the history from that time, it's sickening. I mean, it is sickening to me, and I think it's sickening to most people to see that outright bigotry. And yet it gets ingrained in a culture, and you're like, well, why are you so against this? And I don't want to, I mean, a lot of that has to do with the Catholic Church, and I don't want to go too deep into that, but I mean, that's partly why that group still looks and says, no, we think it should be illegal. And I think how perverse that it was actually made illegal to discriminate against that group.
Yep.
But it really is, it's kind of has to happen almost word of mouth over time for people to gain the confidence that legalizing the substance is not a mistake and will not result in the parade of horribles that they have in their mind. And the interesting thing, I said that it's partly word of mouth, partly it is seeing that in the other states, those parade of horribles generally have not occurred.
Right.
And what has occurred is tremendous tax revenue. And so that may have has overtaken Aunt Helen more recently, but all of that contributes to folks getting more comfortable. And I can sit and go into a legislator's office and describe the chemistry and biology of the endocannabinoid system and blah, 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 and why it's safe, but that's not how people are taking in information nowadays. So let me pivot to global. And it's all relevant, right, as to how fast the United States moves. But just to give folks an understanding of how broad this is, my group, the Denton's Cannabis Group, of course, have folks in Canada, very active. My partner, Eric Foster, leads the group there. But we have, just take the Americas. We cover almost throughout the Americas, Mexico, Central America. The Caribbean has vast legalization of cannabis to some degree. And I'm going to swing back to that in a second. And then South America as well. And so then you pivot to Europe, and you have Germany that's legalized medical cannabis, but now states that it's going to legalize adult cannabis. The Czech Republic quickly comes out and says, if Germany's doing it, we're doing it too,
Right.
which is, we're going to see more of that.
Right.
Trust me, we're going to see more of that as that goes on. And that's how things proliferate in those areas. We have lawyers on the African continent who are working on cannabis. And as you alluded to, and a place that's moving very slowly on this in many ways, all of a sudden you have Thailand that's legalizing, and other countries looking and saying, perhaps we should to some degree as well. So enormous global movement and enormous upside from the global movement. And when I talk about the industry and what that upside may be, I want everyone to remember it may be something more than how we envision cannabis right now. Like, there are many products available. There are an unbelievable amount of products available. I mean, any way you can think about getting cannabis into the body, there are products on the state legal, not every state program, but here in Illinois, for example, you can go into a dispensary and purchase whole flower, vapes, edibles, drinks, patches, We used to have suppositories that are coming back online, I understand. So just so many ways of getting product in the body, but we haven't had the more nuanced pharmaceutical development, with a few exceptions, of how do you put together the cannabinoids, the terpenes, to make more directed medicine. And we'll see significant advancements in that as well, and significant advancements in just brand equity of the brands that exist that have very little. So I think we're going to continue to see incredible movement on the global level. And there is, you mentioned this before. When I started, I literally could not say what I was doing in the elevator,
Right.
because you don't know who you're on there with, and it was too stigmatizing. There basically, you could not separate in people's mind the illegality versus even the advocacy for legality.
Right.
I can't say what I do now in an elevator because everyone wants to talk about it. I mean, everyone wants to talk about it. I just visited my parents at senior living. They're 90 and 88. And when the folks there learn what I do, they want to talk about it and what relief they might be able to get for their pain and sleeping. Like, so many people are, the speed at which people are actually recovering from the stigma, I think, is fairly interesting at this point, and that is moving fairly rapidly.
And such a great point. You know, that's why our firm, when we entered the space, we enter spaces with a purpose, and so pretty quickly, just to communicate why we're in this space, you know, we explained that our purpose is to make cannabis as common and culturally accepted as aspirin or alcohol. You know, you should not think of it as, you know, this stigmatized, taboo topic, because you can take it as medicine, you can take it recreationally. Obviously, you do it with balance and with knowledge about what you're, you know, consuming.
Right.
But it should be a choice. It should be an option for people in all different areas. I know you have to run soon to talk to one of those senators we talked about before, or their office about safe banking. So you know, we'll kind of wrap this up, but you know, always a pleasure talking with you, Eric. Thank you for fighting the fight for as long as you have, and continue to do to move the regulatory framework forward. And a real pleasure to have this conversation. Would love to do it again soon.
I really appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate all of your efforts and thoughtfulness in the space. And if I may just add one point to complement what you said, we just had a conversation about, like, all the states and all over the globe, and we are like just barely touching on this, right? I mean, there's so much more to discuss, and I'd love to do that. My group now. And I appreciate all of my colleagues and the acclaim that we've gotten in the legal press and all that. And we have folks across offices and across subject matter areas. But for me, and I think the Integral team, it's about providing safe, legal, affordable access to cannabis and cannabinoid products for those who would benefit from it.
Yep.
And I just try to keep that in mind. You know, there's a lot of dollars at stake. I understand that. I understand what I'm working on, and I understand my duties to my clients in the firm. But I think all of that can be done consistently with that sort of initial mission. And I'll say this, a lot of people in the industry feel that way. And working with like-minded folks on something like that, I'm just very grateful to do that, and grateful that you're a part of that as well. So thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. You know, this industry goes through its ups and downs, but if you have that kind of focus on what the end result should be, that's how, you know, we'll get this industry to have a legitimacy like any other industry does in this country. So
I would also, yeah, I think that's really well put. I think that's really an excellent point.
Yep. So thank you for your time. You know, we'll do this again, but appreciate you educating our audience, both from people who are industry insiders to folks that are newer to the space, and appreciate your leadership at Dentons to push this industry along.
I'd love to tell you that you'll like have this out there, and our conversation will foreshadow some prime moving of getting safe over the line. I would not bet the ranch on that, but we'll see what happens.
Let's let's roll the dice and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I'll talk to you later. It's great talking with you. I hope you have a good rest of the week. And again, thank you for the flexibility on the time.
Thank you. Appreciate
All
it.
right.
Good
Yeah,
luck with
take
your
care.
call.